So last week we finished up talking about how David had to pass so many tests that God had for him. In order for him to be king, he had to go through so much with King Saul and so many tests he had to pass. Well, we're at the point in the story now where King Saul, his life is over, his time is finished, and David is about to step into the kingdom that God has for him. Now the Philistines were fighting against Israel, and the men of Israel fled before the Philistines and fell slain on Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines overtook Saul and his sons, and the Philistines struck down Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, the sons of Saul. The battle pressed hard against Saul, and the archers found him, and he was badly wounded by the archers. Then Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised come and thrust me through and mistreat me." But his armor-bearer would not, for he feared greatly. Therefore Saul took his own sword and fell upon it. And when his armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead, he also fell upon his sword and died with him. Thus Saul died, and his 3 sons, and his armor-bearer, and all his men on the same day together. You know, as I think about David in this story and what he's been going through for the last 15 years up to this point, he had to feel like multiple times that maybe Samuel missed it. I mean, I know Samuel anointed me and everything, but it's been 15 years and it looks like nothing has changed. Saul is still on the throne. 15 years I've been going through this, and you just think about going through something for that amount of time. There's no way that he didn't question the call, that he didn't question Samuel, that he didn't question God and wonder, is this ever going to happen? Am I ever going to step into this kingship, this place that God has for him? Because he was, which rightfully so, he was so intent on not putting his hand to it and making it happen. He was never going to overthrow Saul. He was never going to get outside of the will of God and go past God. He was going to follow the Lord all the way. That was his heart. And so if he wasn't going to put his own hand to it, he was just left to let God be God and sort these things out in his own time and his own pace. And it was 15 years that he sat back and watched that. And so, not that he was just waiting for Saul to die or that he's happy Saul died. You actually find out later that it was devastating to David that Saul died. David loved Saul even after all he had done and the way he had treated him. But for us, you have to realize that God's timing is not our timing. And most people, after 4 months, 5 months, 6 months of waiting and being patient, we're done. We're tired of, we're going to put our hand to it. We're going to make something happen in our life. But if you want to truly find the blessing of God, then you have to be willing to wait as long as He's wanting to wait. You have to follow Him and let Him guide and direct the course and the path of your life. And sometimes it takes a lot longer than we would want it to, but God knows what He's doing. So even though Saul is dead, David is not going to just waltz into the kingdom and this be a smooth, peaceful transition, because there are a lot of really powerful men with really powerful ambitions, and this is actually going to be a little bit of a process. It's going to actually take 7 years from this point in order for him to get the full kingdom. After Saul dies, David has a conversation with the Lord to ask him basically, what's the next step? How do I proceed from here? In 2 Samuel 2, verse 1, it says, "After this, David inquired of the Lord, 'Shall I go up into any of the cities of Judah?' And the Lord said to him, 'Go up.' David said, 'To which shall I go up?' And he said, 'To Hebron.'" Now the reason this stands out to me is because you would think that when Saul died, that was David's cue right there. He knows this is what he's been waiting for, right? You would think that the only thing holding me back from being king is Saul. He's now dead. The kingdom is mine. The first thing David does is he goes and he seeks the Lord. And he says, what's next? He doesn't assume that the kingdom is automatically his. He's so connected to the Lord. He's so intent on being led by the Spirit that he goes to God and he inquires and he says, what is my next step? What do you want me to do? And from what we know about David, had God told him, it's still not your time yet, he would have followed that. He would have followed it. That was his heart. But God said, no, you're not going to take the whole kingdom. He said, I want you to go up to Hebron and you're going to begin there. And that's where David started his kingdom, in a very small section of Israel. And David brought up his men who were with him, everyone with his household, and they lived in the towns of Hebron. And the men of Judah came, and there they anointed David king over the house of Judah. But Abner, the son of Ner, commander of Saul's army, took Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, and brought him over to Mahanaim, and made him king over Gilead and the Ashurites and Jezreel and Ephraim and Benjamin and all Israel. Ishbosheth, Saul's son, was 40 years old when he began to reign over Israel, and he reigned 2 years. But the house of Judah followed David, and the time that David was king in Hebron over the house of Judah was 7 years and 6 months. So what's going on here is Israel is a large country. It's a large area that has multiple territories and things like that. You could think of it like the United States and our 50 states. It has multiple areas, multiple prominent cities and centers and things like that. So Judah was a section of Israel. If you go all the way back to when God was allotting the land to the tribes, there were actually 12 territories. And these territories were named after the sons of Jacob. So you've got the tribe of Judah, you've got Benjamin. So you'll hear a lot of these names. For example, Ishbosheth was put over Ephraim and Benjamin. Well, these are all territories that were given to the sons of Jacob. So they kept those names throughout the years. So even though there were 12 territories, the whole area was looked at as Israel, because you'll remember that Jacob, God changed his name to Israel. When you look at all the 12 territories, it's all considered Israel. But throughout the years and the generations of the people of God, some of these territories were lost. Some of them were defeated because of sin and rebellion and things like that. So now it's actually much smaller than it was originally. But really what you're dealing with at this point in the timeline is the promised land that God originally gave to the 12 sons of Jacob has been shrunk down to this is all that's left. It's a very small section that's left, and that's happened because of repeated sin and rebellion and disobedience. So when David takes over as king, he only takes over a specific section, a smaller section, which is it's called the house of Judah, but he was in the city called Hebron. Saul's commander of his army, Abner, doesn't want David to be king. He wants Saul's house, Saul's family to continue reigning. So he takes Saul's son, Ishbosheth, and he sets him up as king over the rest of Israel. So now there's this almost civil war going on between the house of David and the house of Saul. So if you look at the map, you will see at the bottom, you can see there right where Hebron is, and that's where David was, right there by the Dead Sea. And a little further north, you will see Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is where Ishbosheth would have been reigning as king. So all of this section right here would have been the portion of the land that the house of Saul was continuing to reign over, and all of this portion down here is where David would have been reigning as king, and he reigned there for 7 years. 2 Samuel 3 verse 1 tells it this way: there was a long war between the house of Saul and the house of David, and David grew stronger and stronger, while the house of Saul became weaker and weaker. But that was over a 7-year process. Eventually, David ruled over the whole kingdom. Then all the tribes of Israel came to David at Hebron and said, "Behold, we are your bone and flesh. In times past, when Saul was king over us, it was you who led out and brought in Israel. And the Lord said to you, you shall be shepherd of my people Israel, and you shall be prince over Israel." So all the elders of Israel came to the king at Hebron, and King David made a covenant with them at Hebron before the Lord, and they anointed David king over Israel. That's all of Israel now. David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. At Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months, and at Jerusalem, he reigned over all Israel and Judah 33 years. So there's kind of the timeline, the big picture. He reigned 7 years at Hebron, and eventually the men of Israel came around. They anointed him king over all of Israel. He reigned there for 33 years for a total of 40 years. So there are a couple big takeaways from our lesson tonight that I see. The first one, I'm so impressed with the path that David chose to take in order to get to be the king. I mean, clearly, multiple times he had the opportunity to put his hand to it and make it happen, but he followed God every step of the way. And for whatever reason, God wanted Saul to remain in that position even after he'd been rejected for 15 years, whether it was to give Saul mercy, whether it was to train David. God had his own purposes, and David never superseded those purposes. He submitted himself to God. Even when Saul died, he still was asking the Lord, is it time now? How do you want me to handle this? Even when he's king at Hebron, he doesn't force his way into Israel. He let God be in control of that process and how it happened. The second thing that stands out to me about this story is that there always seems to be a group of people that are on the wrong side of God. They're not in tune with what God is doing. So God's purpose was for David to be king, but yet you had Abner and the house of Saul and all those that are following him fighting against it. For 15 plus years you had Saul fighting against it. Now you have Saul's commander, his sons, and the house of Saul all fighting against it. This has always been amazing to me, that whatever God is doing in the earth, there's always a group of people fighting it. And I'll get more specific and say there always seems to be a group of Christians fighting it. There always seems to be a group of people that supposedly are following God fighting what God is doing. I mean, in Jesus' day, it was the Pharisees. You know, God's doing something in the earth. The Son of God is right before them, but the religious people are fighting it. They're fighting it tooth and nail. They're saying this is not God. God's not in it. I remember when modern worship was first starting to come into the church. You know, you had churches that were doing hymns and things like that, and they fought it tooth and nail. And now even, you know, Baptist churches and more traditional churches have more modern worship now. You know, there's always a group of people that are fighting what God is doing. And I'm not sure why we do that. I can think of a few reasons. But as I've observed God moving in the church, even now I see it happening today in many ways. There's always a group of people that are fighting it instead of being in touch and in tune with what God is doing. And I see that stark difference between David and Saul. David was the type of person that whatever God's doing, I want to be a part of it. If it means me living in a cave, I want to be a part of it. If it means me serving under a maniacal king, I want to be a part of it. If it means reigning at Hebron while King Saul's commander and his sons take over Israel, I want to be a part of it. Whatever God is doing, I just want to be a part of it. I don't have to have anything my way. But then you have another group, like the Pharisees, like the house of Saul, that says, no, we know what God is doing. We're at the center of it, and it has to look like this, and this is what we want. And they pursue it, and they fight it. And many times they find themselves actually fighting against God. And the lessons I learned from that in this story is, number one, God's always going to win. The Pharisees didn't win. King Saul's house didn't win. They eventually came around. They had to submit to what God was doing. God always wins. You know, it would be better to find yourself on God's side in life when things are changing, things are transitioning. It's important to check your motives and your heart and your spirit and make sure that you're in tune with what God is doing. Why is it that people find themselves fighting against God? Why is it that they find themselves on the wrong side of what God is doing? Well, I think there are a few reasons. I think number one is selfish ambition. People have their own ambitions. They're not actually that concerned about what God wants. They just want things their way. They want their power, their influence, their notoriety, their fame, and it clouds their vision. It clouds their perspective. I think another reason is just fear. They're afraid of what change would mean. They don't trust God enough to just sit back and let God do his thing. That's why the Pharisees and even Saul of Tarsus, before he was Paul the Apostle, they're fighting Christians, throwing them in jail. They're afraid that if they just stand back, that God's not big enough to take care of it. We have to get involved and we have to take care of it. David was content to just sit back. He trusted God enough to sit back and go, no, God's big enough to handle this and I don't have to put my hand to it. But I remember Jesus being frustrated and amazed at this with the Pharisees, and he even said to him, he said, how is it that you're so good at predicting the times and the seasons and the weather? But he said, you cannot see, you cannot sense what God is doing. How is that? And the reason is because wrong motives cloud our vision. It clouds our perspective. So many people don't know what God is doing in a generation, in a nation, in a church, in a family. They don't understand what God is doing because their vision is clouded by wrong motives. Wrong motives cloud our vision. In other words, if you want something so bad and you want that thing more than you want God, more than you just want the will of God, the desire for that thing can cloud your vision of hearing what God is saying. It can bring confusion, and you're not clear to hear God. When you really get that clarity to hear the voice of God is when you have no agenda, and you've laid your desires down. Your desires have been crucified before Christ, and your only desire is, I want to please God. I want to live for God. I want to make God happy. When you get in that place of laying those desires down and crucifying, that's when clarity comes. That's when a person can hear from God. How many times do I hear people as a pastor saying, God told me, God told me, God told me, and God didn't tell them nothing, because they thought God told them, but what actually was happening, they were confused by their own motives and their own agenda and their own desires. But they would be sure that God was showing them this. And what I found is so many times the confusion there comes in because you haven't crucified your motives. You wanted God to be saying this, but God wasn't saying it. And it was when you crucify your motives and your desires, that's when you get in that place of clarity where you can truly hear the voice of God and what He wants you to do.